if you guys are like me, you probably have a family. Most people do. And your family will gather from time to time. I was talking to somebody last night at the speaker's dinner, and he realized that I'm an American, even though I live in Scotland. And he said, "You Americans, you just live to work, right? And you never gather with your family." And I said, "Well, we do like once a year. We take 2 days off, and it's great." And what happens when we gather as a family is we sit around and we tell stories. And there's a story that one of my families always tells when we get together, and it's about an older brother that I have and a younger brother that I have. And if you've got brothers, or even if you've got somebody who acts like an older brother, you've probably experienced this phenomenon where you like to pick on your older brother as much as possible until he finally gets fed up and beats on you a little bit. And so I was home from college. We all were, and it was Thanksgiving in the States, and it's a big holiday. The family was in the living room, and my older brother said, "Well, I'm going to go upstairs and take a shower," right? And so my other brother and I said, "Yes, we can't wait for this," right? Because we knew that we could pick the lock into the bathroom. And so he goes up and he starts taking the shower, and he's singing in the shower, right? And we find a big bucket and we put some ice in it, and we go to the sink and we fill it up, right? And he hears us kind of messing around as we pick the lock, and he says, "Don't do anything, right? Or I'm going to come out there and get you." And we take the bucket and we dump it over the shower, and it's cold water, and he's pissed off, right? And he says, I swear, if you do that again, I'm going to come running out after you." But we knew this was a lie because all the family was out in the family room just down the hall, and he didn't have any clothes on, right? And so we fill the bucket up again, and we dump it over, and all of a sudden, he just comes tearing out of the shower, and he runs down the hall, and he tackles us in front of the whole family, and there's this naked guy, and he's just pounding on my younger brother Mike and I, and everybody's screaming. They don't know what's going on, and the father comes out, and he grabs us and get over here and sit down. He's sitting on the couch, and he just has a pillow, right? And my older brother is he loves rules, right? I was telling this story in in Switzerland. I said, "You guys know what I'm talking about, right?" He loves rules, right? And so for him, apologizing and making up and all this was a big deal, and saying sorry and doing the right thing was very important to him. And this is an infamous line in our family where he said, "I don't care what you do to me." He's yelling at the father. He says, "I'm not going to say I'm sorry. I'm not sorry," right? And so this is a story that we tell literally every year that we get together. Another thing that happens in my family is whenever we order a pizza and it comes, we take one out of the box and we start to eat a slice, and somebody in my family will say, "Don't burn your lip on the cheese, Dad," because when we were like 5 and 6 years old, my dad said, "Don't burn your lip on the cheese," and then took a bite and burned his lip on the cheese, right? And so we know everybody in this room has stories like this that they tell when they get together. And let's just review very quickly what design is. I think we all know. Here's the dictionary definition. And here's the definition of what narrative is, which is basically storytelling, okay? Now, who am I, right? My name's John. I'm from Scotland. It's in the north of the UK. And I'm the CEO of a company called Administrate, and we build software for training providers, right? So that's what I could do to introduce myself. Or I could do it slightly differently and say, "My name's John," and picture for a second the typical training company or training department, right? Training company usually has 4 or 5 administrators, they have 20 instructors, and they have hundreds of students taking these very high-value courses. And all the administration work needs to be done perfectly. Otherwise, people get upset, you lose money, your reputation suffers. Our software helps you manage all of the things that have to happen around the delivery of education, like reporting and billing and workflow and CRM, and that's what we do, right? Do you see the difference there? Okay, I just told you a little story to separate what we do from what we actually do, which is the facts, and that tends to work much better, and my guess is most of you in the audience have a better idea of what we do now than just about 15 seconds ago. So, why is this important, right? Well, we've been talking a lot about products, and tomorrow I'll talk about how to build products a little bit more in detail. But let's not forget that my software company is actually not a software company, right? We're a company that's dedicated to make the lives of our customers better and make them more successful. If I had a magic wand that I could pull out of a box and just wave at our customer and make them, help them save twice as much time or whatever as they were doing before, we would do that, right? I like software and I'm a geek, but if I can make money doing what we do without having software, sometimes it's a lot less of a headache. And so really companies and organizations and software products are problem solvers that are cloaked by software. And the thing about narrative is that narrative really helps amp up communication, okay? It's really a cheap way that is highly effective for us to communicate better. And communication is really, really important. I don't think I've ever gotten into a situation where there's two people that are disagreeing, or an organization is dysfunctional, or a product is built that nobody wanted, and you go in and you go, wow, everybody perfectly communicates here, right? That's like never happened. Communication is always a problem. And so anything we can do to amp up our communication or make our communication more effective, I think is really important. So, what are some of the benefits of narrative, right? I grew up, I'm an American, I live in Scotland, but I actually grew up overseas in China, in Asia. And I went to international school, and we would go on a trip every year in the spring. And one year, these were often organized by my mom, who is a teacher at the school, right? And my mom likes to travel, and she likes to do crazy stuff. And so we found ourselves, rafting down the Yangtze River on a raft that was just lattice and then, inflated goat carcasses, right? And so we're kind of careening down there. And this is just the type of thing that we would do on our school trips. And so one time we were in Gansu province. We were heading towards the second highest holy place for Tibetan Buddhists. And we were in a van. There's like 15, 20 foreign students. We're driving along, and all of a sudden a police car comes up behind us, and the lights are on. And, they pull us over. And it turns out that we didn't have some sort of insurance permit that you need in order to travel in Gansu province. And the other problem was that there's a fine that would be attached if you were caught without this. And so we all went to the police station, and the teachers went in, and we're talking to the police. And all of a sudden, one of the teachers came out and said, hey, John, can you come in and help us a little bit? I'm like, what is going on, right? I walk in there, and the police department can't get their printer to work, right? And so they have Chinese Windows 3.1, right? It's even though it was the late 90s, that's what they had. And there, proceeded to be a little negotiation. Well, if we get your printer to work, what are we going to do about this fine, right? And so I fixed the printer, and we didn't have to pay the fine, and off we went, right? And I actually wrote a blog post about this story a number of years ago. And people love this story. People that I've never met will come up and be like, could you tell that police story again? Or people that I haven't met in a long time, or what was that police story, right? And it surprised me the first few years that this was happening, but people just really love stories, and they remember them, right? Better retention. When I was working in South Florida before I moved to Scotland, I worked for a mail-order pharmacy company, and I like to call it the world's most expensive, largest model railroad, right? It was a very large assembly line, and pills and drugs would come in from a drug distributor. We would load them on the assembly line, and then orders would come in from patients, and the drugs would get dispensed, and things would run around on the assembly line. Pharmacists would check it, out it goes via mail, and it was a really neat operation. I learned a lot. And one of the things I'll never forget is we had a rule, right? When these drugs came in from the distributor, you'd pull out a box of pharmaceuticals, or a bottle in some cases, and you'd take it and you'd scan it, right? And then you'd put it in another box, and off it would go on the assembly line. And we had a rule, which was, I don't know if you guys have ever bought anything at a supermarket with those awful self-scanning devices, right? But you buy 2 cans of Coke, and a lot of times you just scan the same can twice, right? We've all done this. We've seen checkout clerks do this, okay? But we had a rule. You can't ever scan something the same that you think is the same twice. You always have to scan everything individually. Well, one day, I was out on the line looking over some things. I'm not a pharmacist, but I was responsible for the tech and the operations. And I was talking to the head pharmacist, and what happens is he comes over, he looks at the order, he checks it on the computer, he checks, okay, and it's his license legally that's responsible for the filling of that prescription, right? So he's checking, I was kind of talking with him, and off the drug goes, and all of a sudden he said, hey John, can you pull that really quick, pull that tote? And so I pulled it off and brought it over, and he looks at it, and he tosses me the bottle, and he says, do you see anything wrong with that? And I said, I don't know, no, it looks fine. What's going on? Well, what had happened was someone who was working at the receiving end had pulled out a bottle and said, "Oh, I've got two," and scanned it twice and put both on the tote, and off it went. And what would happen is the labels actually happened to be remarkably similar between these two drugs. And if he hadn't caught that, then we would have killed that patient because those two drugs would have interacted, okay? And so there was a mistake that was made, but actually the mistake that had been made by us when we were training was we did not incorporate narrative to make it memorable as to why you should individually scan. They just thought, well, this is a dumb rule and I'll save some time, right? The other thing about narrative is that there is better attention, right? We know that people love stories, right? But there's actually real power here. So here's Buffer, which is a pretty well-known blog, and they make a pretty neat app for social media. But they actually talk about this. They A/B tested that one blog post. Both of them are describing the exact same things. One had a story and one didn't, and the one that did performed remarkably better. This is a Harvard Business Review article, and it talks about why we love stories. Actually, when we're listening to a story and we're engaged, there's a chemical, oxytocin, which is released, which makes us more relaxed and more attentive, and it's a remarkable thing, actually. The other thing that I love about stories is they expose skill gaps, particularly when you're going through and you're trying to figure out what you're supposed to do with a client with regards to your product, right? Pretty common way this happens is people say, "Oh, I need a report," or "Can you add a column to this report?" Right? That we've all heard this. We get it a million times a day, right? A lot of us would just want to say no, but we probably know we should explore this a little bit. And so what I like to do is I like to say, "All right, help me understand. Let's say Bob is going to do his job and he's looking for this and he wants," and they'll say, no, Bob would never do that. Bob's the manager, right? It's Tom that does the job. Okay, now we're starting to engage, right? And we're getting better info just from starting and putting a story into play. Does that make sense to everyone? All right, and people love stories, right? Sorry, this screen is so huge, sometimes I glance back and get disoriented, right? People love stories, all right? We know this, right? The stories are some of the most reliable, most enduring facets of culture that exist, right? Ancient stories have persisted over thousands of years, and actually there's a clue there, right? A lot of these stories were told to remind civilizations of where they came from. Don't make these mistakes, right? Don't do that thing that silly king did 2,000 years ago, right? We've encoded instructive things, things about our culture, what makes us unique into stories as cultures. And narrative really quickly adds and conveys a lot of meaning, right? It doesn't take long to put just a little bit of meaning into play when we're incorporating a story. I've given this talk once before, but we actually have most people at our company watch the video. And we were at a trade show out in Las Vegas about a couple months ago, and we had a girl who's relatively new working with me at the booth. And the thing I love about Natasha is she takes feedback and she's always learning and she's always improving. And so we were sitting there, and we're kind of a small company, so our booth isn't impressive, and people were walking by, and she would say, "Would you like to enter our whiskey raffle?" Okay, we're from Scotland, and we put a bottle of whiskey in our trade show booth. We don't do this when we're in the Middle East, but when we are in North America, we raffle, or in a European country, we raffle off a bottle of whiskey if you sign and scan your badge, right? And what it does is it brings people over to the booth much, much quicker, right? And they're curious, and they're like, "What is this crazy company that's giving away alcohol at this trade show," right? And we do this for a couple of reasons, right? The first is we have the bottle of whiskey, right? That is one bit of memory. And then it lets us tell a story about how we're from Scotland. And then people go, "Oh, wow, that's a neat tie-in," right? We say, "I hand-carried this bottle of whiskey," which is true, from Scotland to here to raffle it off for you, okay? And we were at this booth, and Natasha was saying, "Would you like to enter our whiskey raffle," right? As people would walk by, "Would you like to enter our whiskey raffle?" She's Macedonian, so she can talk really, really fast. "Would you like to enter our whiskey raffle?" And I said, "Look, Natasha, just curious, did you watch that talk about narrative?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, why aren't you incorporating any of that into your pitch," right? And she's thought about that, and she goes, "You're right." And so then she changed it, and she said, "Would you like to enter our raffle, right? Which actually simplifies the question. People would say, what? And then she would tell the story. We're from Scotland. We brought this by hand. And then the conversion rate went way up just from a small change like that. And you might say, well, this is a stupid story. I'm not in sales. I don't go to trade shows. But just remember that just injecting a little bit of that into your day-to-day interactions will go a long way. And narrative really transcends cultures. So another time I was driving to North Carolina, and I was on my way to a consulting gig, and I was speeding because, that's just what you do, I guess. And driving through North Carolina, speeding at pretty high speed, and I was pretty good at watching out for cops. I didn't have a radar detector, but you kind of, when you're a habitual repeat offender on speeding, you kind of just learn where they like to hang out and so on. But I was late, and so I was gunning it. I was blasting it. And so I was hurtling down I-40, and all of a sudden there's a cop over there in the bushes, and he was in an amazing spot, right? He was way down, kind of undercover. I think the bastard had put camouflage over his car or something, right? And so he comes blasting out. The other thing is, a lot of times if they're wheeled down in the ditch like that, it takes them a while to get out safely, right? And put their lights on. And so you can usually exit really quickly, and then it's like, oh, they lost sight and all this. So anyway, he had a perfect spot. It was a perfect day for it. He blasts out, and he catches up with me, pulls me over, right? And he says, where are you going so fast? And I said, well, I flew in from Chicago. I'm going to this meeting with a client, and I'm late. And he said, oh, well, what do you do, right? And believe it or not, at one point, I wasn't as clean cut as I am now, right? At one time, I had long hair, and I looked a little scruffy, right? And I said, well, I'm a technology consultant. And he said, really? And I said, yeah. And I said, I'm going to this meeting, and can you just hurry up with this ticket? And he said, well, why don't you come back to the car with me? And I said, okay, I get out. And he says, I have this problem with my computer, right? And I'm like, oh, okay. And his screensaver was coming on. He had a computer on the dash. And so I disabled the screensaver for him. No ticket. Off we went. And the problem was solved, right? And so what I love about this story is that it's the exact same thing. When I tell the first story, a lot of times if we're in Northern Europe, people are like, oh, China is so corrupt. They are so corrupt, right? And then I tell it, or Americans will say the same thing, and then I tell this story, and it's a real thing. It actually happened, right? And people don't forget this. Last night, somebody was saying, oh, so, Edinburgh, that's like in England, right? And I said, well, no, it's in Scotland, and it's a pretty big difference, right? And the guy said, he's a Polish guy, he said, yeah, I went to Edinburgh, and it was during the festival, and I said, this is just amazing. England is such an amazing country. And everybody was like, no, this is Scotland, right? And they got really, animated. And I said, yeah, it's kind of like me saying Warsaw is my favorite Russian city, right? And then he goes, oh, right? And it clicked. And so, you can get these stories, and they mesh together, and they really will transcend culture. And here's some examples of when we can use this, right? And it's a lot more common than you think. Product design, onboarding. Onboarding is a really great time to use stories, because what happens is the person that bought your product may not actually be the person that's using your product, or may not be the persons that you're training on your product. And so they might not actually have a good context for what it is that you're trying to do. The more you can inject narrative and explain how this is supposed to work with a story, the better it's going to be. Also, the other thing is, when you're a small company, we tend to be really nervous, right? Small companies are like, oh, I must act like a big company, right? And then big companies are sitting on the other side, and they're like, we must act like a small company, right? And there's never this time where it's like perfect to be one or the other, right? But small companies have a problem in that if you're the first user that has ever used my product, I'm nervous, right? Minimum viable product. Things probably suck a lot. I'm probably know of a couple bugs on this screen where you're going to blow your leg off if you touch that button, right? But the more you can tell stories about, oh yeah, you've got this challenge. I was just talking to the customer last week about this, and here's how we solved it, right? Now what I've done is I've validated your fear, I've built trust with you, and I've given you confidence that we're going to get a solution that comes out. The more that you can build that, the better things will go. All right? So a lot of times I get asked, particularly in my company, well, why do I have to be good at telling stories? I'm not in sales, I'm not in marketing, blah, blah, blah. And I said, look, All of us are in the business of communication, right? We all have to communicate. And it's everyone's job to make sure that messages are being sent and messages are being received. I often like to say communication is message sent, message received, because a lot of times my staff will come to me and we've got a very multicultural team, right? I think we've got like 13 nationalities and 30 plus people on the team. And you've got Americans and you've got Eastern Europeans and you've got British. And a lot of times the British will be like, but John, I've been telling you this for like 6 months every day, right? And I'm like, yeah, well, I didn't hear it, right? Like, you can bash me on the head next time when you're telling it, right? It's a cultural thing. But if we can couch that in the context of a story and say, hey, John, this user is going about their job this way, and then they get to this point and there's a bug and they can't do their job anymore. That really gets me to listen, right? Instead of, we need to fix this bug, right? Whatever, yeah, of course we need to fix all bugs, right? Bugs are bugs. But if you can put a bit of narrative around what's happening, then you'll get me to listen, all right? All right. Now, one of the biggest problems that I encounter when I'm talking about this with people is they go, well, my life's really boring, right? I'm boring, and my company's boring. Well, I've only ever worked at boring companies, okay? I'm really passionate about them, but if I come to you and I'm like, yes, we help training companies be so much more efficient, you're like, oh, wow, the next European unicorn, right? No, nobody thinks that, okay? I'm really passionate about it, but nobody cares. Well, I would just say, Start looking at your life in a slightly different manner, okay? The other day, this is actually a few months ago, there's 2 cities in Scotland, right? There's Edinburgh, and it's very posh and beautiful and really nice place to live. And then there's Glasgow, right? And that's a little bit more rough and bigger, and it's not quite as beautiful, although there's many beautiful spots. And basically there's a chip on every Glaswegian who's a person from Glasgow's shoulder about Edinburgh, right? And they're all kind of like annoyed or whatever about Edinburgh, and it's very similar dynamic to what New York City and New Jersey kind of go through. But the thing is, Glasgow has got a much better rock music scene. Edinburgh has no rock music scene. And if there's somehow comes to pass that there's a rock gig in Edinburgh, the whole audience is Glaswegians and me, right? And so there's a rock show that I really wanted to go to, and I was going to catch the train over to Glasgow. And it turned out that the express line, which only has 4 or 5 stops and runs for about 45 minutes to Glasgow, was having a problem. And so I got on the non-express line. And let's just say that because the tickets are more expensive on the express line and the tickets are less expensive on the local line, that there's a different clientele, right, on these trains. And the one stops like 35 times, the other stops 5 or 6. Anyway, I get on it, it's fine. I'm reading, right? And I'm kind of like looking around, and I hear this ridiculous coughing like a few rows back on the train, right? And it's coughing really loud. I'm like, what is going on? Well, I don't know. Just ignore it. Go back to reading, right? And what is the term in Poland for a Ned? In Scotland, that means a non-educated delinquent. And every country has them. They're kind of like, 10 to 18 years old, and they often wear sweatpants, and they don't have a job, and they may have dropped out of school, right? You're all thinking of the word. We don't have to shout it out. But there was a couple of guys that may have fit this particular stereotype, right? And they're in the back. And the guy was making a really loud coughing noise. And then they got up and moved, and the guy sat down opposite to me. And I'm sitting there reading, and he starts coughing again, like really, really loudly, really obnoxiously. And I'm looking at him, and I stare over at him, and one of my favorite things about myself, I have many, but one of my favorite things is that if I'm staring at you, I'm never going to break, right? I'm just going to sit there, and I'm just going to stare, right? And so I stare at this kid, and finally he breaks. I'm like, yes, I'm so cool. And then we pull into a station, and the guy jumps up and gets off the train, right? And then all of a sudden, the ticket collector walks by, and then the train gets close to going, and the doors are starting to close, and the kid jumps back on, right? So I figure it out. They're using this coughing mechanism to warn each other of where the ticket collector is, and they're dodging a fare, right? And so I'm like, God damn it, I fucking hate these kids, right? I'm a law-abiding citizen, right? And, it's very British of me, actually. And so we pull into Glasgow, it's the last stop, and they get off with me, and I see them get off, but I know that there's barriers at the end of this thing, so I'm thinking, what is going to happen, right? I'm walking along, and I put my ticket in the barrier, go through, and then I look over and I hear this girl. She's going, excuse me, please stop, right? Because it's the UK, and we ask please when criminals are jumping the barrier. And these kids are jumping over the barrier, right? And so she's like, hey, like pointing or whatever, and everybody's looking, and he starts running by, and I just reach out and I grab him, right? This is pretty scrawny little kid, and I grab him, and at that moment I look over, and I'm like, oh, hero, this is amazing. I've waited all my life for this. And the girl is like horrified. She's got both of her hands. And then I just realized that actually I'm probably creating a much bigger problem here by catching this guy, because then the police are going to have to come and it's going to be a mess. And so I let the kid go, and he runs out into the square, and then they're waiting for me when I come out. I'm just walking, but they were running. And they're like, why did you do that? And we exchanged a couple of fuck yous, and off they went, right? And so I go to the concert, and I have a nice time, and I get back, and I'm going home, and it's the last train to Edinburgh. It's 11:30, right? And, at concerts, I like to, drink beer, drink some alcohol, right? And I get on the train, and I realize, the bathroom on the train is, like, out of order, right? And I'm like, oh, man, okay, it's a 45-minute train ride. So I'm like, okay, well, I could jump out at a station, but it's the last train, so I'd have to get like a taxi home or a bus or something, and there's really no option to get off the train. And so we peel into Edinburgh's station, and I'm like freaking out, I'm all I can think of is the bathroom. And so I race out, right, and I get to the bathroom, and in the UK, you have to put money in to get into the bathroom, right? And so I'm like fumbling around, I have some change, and I stick it in, and then it pops back out, and it says, exact change required, right? And I'm like, oh my goodness. And so what do? I jump the turnstile, right? And I run in, and I use the bathroom, and somebody goes, hey, right, as I jump the turnstile. And this is just one of those stories, right, where at the end of the day, I was jumping the turnstile just like those other Neds, and this happened to me, right? And actually, this is not a very great story, but it just happened, and I noticed it, and I started practicing it, and people tend to really enjoy the fact that at the end of the day, I was just the same as this kid that I was mocking for most of the time, all right? So all of our lives, you can seek out bits and pieces for what to tell a great story, all right? So now here's a quick warning. When you start to get good at this, okay, you need to be careful, because when you start to get good at telling stories, you can start to shape or manipulate or change actually the debate, okay? So one of my favorite examples of this is, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Parker Space Pen. Has anybody ever heard of that? Okay, yes, all right, over there. And it's great, and it comes in a couple of varieties. I didn't bring mine today, but the silver bullet is my favorite, right? And you pull it off, and it's great, and it can write upside down, and it can write in space, right? And the story goes, and this is true, that they spent at the time in the late 50s, it was like several $1 million to develop this, right? And would a ballpoint pen write in space? No, not in zero gravity. So they take it up, and it works. And then we've got a solution to be able to write in space. And the story goes that the Russians took a pencil. Okay, we spent $2-3 million on a space pen at the time, which is a lot more money today. And the Russians took a pencil. And this is repeated often. It was actually on a episode of The West Wing, right, American television show. And the problem with this is that it's not actually true, okay? It's not actually true, because you don't want pencil shavings floating around in zero gravity gumming up your instruments. The Russians actually licensed the technology and bought a whole bunch of space pens from America, and they ultimately made money and solved the problem, okay? So just keep that in mind. All right, so crafting relevant narrative is hard, okay? Injecting narrative is easy. Crafting relevant narrative can be a bit of a challenge. And just because we don't have a whole lot of time, I'm going to skip ahead and talk about how to craft a great story, okay? So here's a couple of tips. Juxtapose the unrelated. And, I realize English is not all of our first language here, but basically it just means take two unrelated things and try to put them together. So one of my favorite things that I like to do is I love to talk about motorcycle racing. I used to do a little bit of amateur motorcycle racing, and I still really like it. And I can find a comparison or a corollary between motorcycle racing and almost anything. I've given talks on motorcycle racing and education, motorcycle racing and software development, motorcycle racing and startups, right? And you can do this, and actually people really remember it because they're like, oh, man, I never even heard about motorcycle racing if you're an American, or I love motorcycle racing, and now it became relevant, okay? The next thing you can do is personalize, right? Inject yourself in the story or inject your life into the story. I cannot believe how many people I meet in Scotland that I've met before, maybe just very briefly, right? And they'll say, how's your cat doing? Okay? And the reason is because I always get asked two questions, right? Well, it's a few more than that. It's, okay, you're in Scotland, you're an American. Did you go to school here? No. Did you marry a Scottish woman? No. Do you have any kids? And I will say, nope, just a cat, right? And people somehow remember that, like over years. They'll be like, oh, how's your cat doing? We heard all about it. And really, I just said, yeah, it's just me, my wife, and a cat, you know, and it's a very interesting thing, right? So personalize it. And then incorporate the great, right? If you really feel like your life is that boring and that meaningless and whatever, that's pretty depressing on one hand. Maybe you should, get some help or get a sad lamp because we're in the north. But you can take other stories from biographies and great tales and so on, and you can incorporate them when you're talking about your particular issue. And then you can also, steal other people's stories, right? Just make sure you attribute them, right? I have long said all through my life that I really would love to be in an airplane crash where nobody was seriously injured or died, okay? Because wouldn't that be amazing? You just have instant credibility, right? Be like, well, that one time I was in an airplane crash, and everybody's just going to listen to you, right? Because nobody's ever really heard that or started a story that way. So I was talking about this at a party about a year or so ago, and a guy goes, oh yeah, I was in an airplane crash where nobody died. And I was like, what? No way. And so I was really envious of this guy, but I said, well, how did it happen? Tell me everything. And he said, well, I was on a flight from India, and we were flying to Moscow. And we were over the Himalayas, and I was looking out as a beautiful moonlit light. I was like, oh, the Himalayas, aren't they beautiful, right? And then all of a sudden, all of the engines went out. The whole plane went silent, right? And I kind of looked around, and there's no noise at all. And he said it's a really eerie thing when you're in an airplane, right? And you could hear like the wings kind of creaking, and that was it. And they come on, they're like, well, we've got an emergency. We can't get our engines restarted, and we need to make a crash landing, basically. And so everybody got in the brace positions, and they come in, and the nearest airport was in Kazakhstan, right? And so the airplane comes in, and it touches down pretty hard. I think it damaged the landing gear quite a bit, but they make it, right? And they roll off, and instantly they get off the plane, and it's the Kazakhstan officials, and they're like, you can't be here. Where are your visas? This is not acceptable, right? And they all put them in a hotel room, and they're like, nobody can leave because you don't have visas, and we don't really know why you're here. And they're like, well, the plane crashed, and so it's this story, right? And I've never, ever forgotten it. And I think it's just an interesting thing. And you can make sure, and I've reused this story all the time, right? He doesn't even know that I'm reusing this story, but I'm doing it all the time. So, all right, short story arc. And very quickly, right? This is a pro tip for how you can basically build a story, any story, out of almost anything, right? First, start with your character, and it can be yourself, right? Make them flawed. I'm pretty flawed. We're all pretty flawed, and our characters should also be flawed. Otherwise, it seems weird, right? Then give them a problem, okay? Talk about how they may have gone through and tried to solve this. This works wonders in product development and sales, okay? You can say, well, let's explore that idea you have, Mr. Customer. Here's how it worked out for us. First, we tried this, that sucked. Then we tried this, that sucked. Then we tried this, they went out of business. And now we're to here. And they go, oh, okay, that makes sense, right? And then provide the solution. And you can object absurdity, right, from time to time, because that tends to actually focus down what it is you're talking about. So a lot of I'm kind of known for ridiculous analogies. I'll be like, what about this donkey and this thing when you're talking about some complex business process, right? Because actually it then takes the focus off the particular details and more on the overall arc. Does that make sense? Okay. This is a movie that it's actually playing here, right? So we can finish the conference and we can go watch this movie, okay? Everybody here needs to watch this movie. I'm involved in a startup, all right? And people will be like, oh, isn't it amazing to be the CEO of a startup? And be like, and it's actually like one of those things where you're like, yeah, it is amazing. And I'm super lucky, I'm really privileged, but it is really fucking hard. Like really, really hard. Like the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And it's scary and it's a mental burden and you never know if you're going to succeed or fail. And you go through kind of years where you're like, oh, I'm such an idiot. And then all of a sudden you're a genius overnight. And that's, then you get nervous because am I a genius? Am I really a genius, right? And this is the startup roller coaster journey. This movie, Inside Out, is a Pixar film that talks about mental health and how we should all be aware of it and how it's something we should talk about more as a society. But the reason I bring it up is because Pixar tells amazing stories. They are the most successful movie studio of all time in terms of money. They bring in the most money for film for any studio ever by like an order of magnitude. They're amazing. And actually, all of their films follow this exact pattern, right? Once upon a time, something. Every day, something. One day, something. Because of that, something. Because of that, something. Until finally, something. Okay? The end. This is a $1 billion formula, okay? Literally. Like, I can't even believe it. There's a book, actually I got this from a talk that I'd seen from Dan Pink, and other people have talked about more and more. But like, I actually didn't believe it, and I started going through with every film and trying to disprove it, and actually it is true. So, all right, cool story, right? So, make sure you practice stories, all right? I practice stories all the time, and I practice them on people that I might never see again because then it's a safe audience, right? Cab drivers, shopkeepers, my wife, okay, I'm going to see her again. But you need to practice, right? It's not always going to be a hit, and you're going to stumble over. And the thing is, in Edinburgh, at the Fringe Festival, which happens every year, I love going to preview shows which start at the beginning of this 30-day festival, and I'll go and watch the comedian give his stand-up routine. And then I like going back at the end and seeing the changes that they've made and the refinements they've made over the 30-day period. It's remarkable, okay? So practice your stories. Here's the last thing. I am not an extrovert, okay? This comes as a shock to everybody that knows me. I'm actually an ambivert. My personality profile is an INTJ, right? Which means that the sentence that sums me up is, I'm sorry you have to die for us, right? Because I'm very goal-driven, all right? Pol Pot was an INTJ, okay? I'm not an extrovert, but I get up here and I talk and so on, and you can do it too and tell a story, all right? So make sure you reiterate the point. And very, very quickly, because we're almost out of time, when I was a little boy, we were up in the Appalachian Mountains. My parents were like, well, we're going to go to church on Sunday. So we did. And we went in this church, and it was full of rednecks. But there's this guy, it was in Tennessee, there's a guy that talked about this story. He had this sermon, right? And he started the sermon, and he said, I want to tell you about this story. And a guy dies, and he goes to hell, and the devil comes to him and says, look, if you can best me in a riddle, then I'll let you go to heaven, right? And the guy said, okay, fine. And he thought about it, and he held out his hand, and he had 3 little small circles in his hand. And he said, I'll bet you cannot make these melt to the devil, right? So the devil brought all of his fire and all of his power on these things that were in his hand and couldn't melt. And finally the devil said, I give up. What is the thing? What is going on here? And he said, well, these are M&Ms. They melt in your mouth, not in your hand, right? And so here's the problem, right? I remember this story, and I don't remember anything else that the guy ever talked about that day. So make sure you reiterate. And again, narrative is communication, just to reiterate to all of you. Make sure that you get these principles into your products and your people and your stories and your customers, and it'll go a long way. All right, thanks. My name's John, and if you got any questions, I'd love to talk about it with you afterwards. Cheers.